Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling affirmative action.
Ooh, that's a big one.
It is, isn't it? It's one of those topics that just keeps coming up, and it feels like everyone has a strong opinion about it.
For sure. And there's so much history and nuance to unpack.
Exactly. So to help us make sense of it all, we've got some great sources lined up.
Yeah, let's see. What do we got?
We've got this debate between Tim Wise, who's a pretty outspoken advocate for affirmative action,
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
and Ward Connerly, who's known for his opposition to race-based policies.
So we're getting both sides of the coin here.
Definitely. And then we're also going to dive into a lecture by Jane Elliott,
The blue eyes, brown eyes lady.
the one and only. She's got this incredibly powerful way of talking about racism that really makes you think.
I can imagine. She doesn't pull any punches.
Nope, not at all. And then we'll wrap things up with another presentation by Tim Wise, this one focusing on economic inequality and policing.
Okay, so we're going pretty broad with this one, huh? From history to education to criminal justice.
It's all connected, right? You can't really talk about affirmative action without understanding all the different systems that play into it.
True, true. So where do we want to start?
Let's jump right into that debate between Wise and Connerly.
Sounds good to me.
I think it's a good way to set the stage, get a sense of the core disagreements right off the bat.
Yeah, they're pretty much on opposite ends of the spectrum, aren't they?
It seems that way. So Wise is coming from this perspective that affirmative action is absolutely necessary to counteract all the advantages that white people have had, historically speaking.
And Connerly's more on the side of saying, hey, we should be focusing on socioeconomic factors, not race.
Right. He's pushing for that colorblind approach, everyone treated equally regardless of their race.
Which sounds good in theory.
Right. But Wise would argue that it's not that simple.
No. I mean, you can't just erase history, can you?
Exactly. And he brings up all these examples of how those historical advantages for white people have had a lasting impact, creating this legacy of inequality.
Like what kinds of examples?
Well, he talks about things like the 1790 Naturalization Act, which limited citizenship to free white folk.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was that explicit.
Yeah, pretty stark, right.
Yeah.
And then there was the Homestead Act, which granted land primarily to white families.
Giving them a huge economic head start, basically.
Exactly. And then you've got programs like the FHA and VA loans, where, you guessed it, early access was mostly limited to white people.
So he's painting this picture of how these policies, even decades ago, created this uneven playing field that we're still dealing with today.
Exactly. And it's hard to argue with those examples.
Yeah, those are pretty concrete.
So does Connerly just ignore all of this? Like, does he just pretend that history didn't happen?
Well, not exactly. He does acknowledge that there was a time when affirmative action was necessary to fight discrimination, when it was really rampant.
Interesting. So he's not denying that it was needed at some point.
No, not really. What he questions is whether it's still needed today.
Ah, okay, I see. So his argument is more like, hey, we've made progress. We don't need those race-conscious policies anymore.
Something like that. He's more focused on making sure everyone's treated equally under the law now.
I can see where he's coming from.
Yeah, it makes sense on the surface.
But Wise would probably say that we're not quite there yet, right? That systemic discrimination is still a thing, even in 2025.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he brings up this study. It's pretty mind-blowing.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
So they found that job applicants with white-sounding names.
Wait, really? Just based on their names?
Yeah, it's crazy, right? So they found that applicants with white-sounding names were 50% more likely to get called back for interviews,
Wow.
even when their qualifications were identical to applicants with black-sounding names.
That's a huge difference. I mean, that really suggests that there's still some serious bias going on, even if it's not always intentional.
Exactly. It's that implicit bias that can be so hard to root out.
So how does Connerly respond to something like that? He must have some sort of counterargument.
Well, he really emphasizes this idea of a level playing field, equal treatment under the law.
Okay, so he's saying that everyone should have the same opportunities regardless of their race.
Exactly. And he believes that socioeconomic affirmative action, which focuses on economic disadvantage, could be a more equitable solution.
Interesting. So instead of focusing on race, we focus on economic background.
Right. Like if you come from a low-income family, you might get preferential treatment in college admissions or something like that.
I can see how that could potentially address some of the inequalities without explicitly considering race.
Exactly. It's kind of a way to get at those underlying issues without getting into the whole race debate.
Okay, I'm definitely curious to hear more about that.
Me too. That's a really interesting idea, but I wonder how effective it would be in practice.
Yeah, I mean, would it really be enough to level the playing field? Or would it just create a whole new set of problems?
Good questions.
Yeah,
And that's something we can definitely explore further as we dive into the other sources.
for sure. But before we do that, I want to bring in Jane Elliott into the
Oh,
mix.
yeah. She's a force of nature.
Her brown eyes exercise is legendary, and she's just got this way of talking about racism that's so raw and unflinching.
She does sugarcoat anything.
Nope. And that's what makes her so effective, you know? She forces you to confront these uncomfortable truths.
I've heard she can be pretty intense.
Oh, she can be. But she's also brilliant and incredibly insightful. What's so impactful about her approach is that she focuses on racism as learned ignorance.
Learned ignorance.
Yeah, like she argues that white people, we've absorbed all these prejudices throughout our lives and we need to actively unlearn them.
So it's not just about being not racist. It's about actively dismantling those racist ideas that we've internalized.
Exactly. And she has this one quote that always sticks with me. She says, "White folks, you gotta change because within 30 years you will be a numerical minority."
Whoa, that's pretty direct.
Yeah, she continues, "And you had better pray that people of color are not going to get even with us." I mean, talk about a wake-up call.
It's like she's saying, hey, the demographics are shifting, and we better figure out how to live together peacefully and equitably, or things could get ugly.
Exactly. And that's what's so powerful about her message, right? It's not just about guilt-tripping white people. It's about acknowledging the reality of the situation and pushing us to create a better future for everyone.
And what does that better future look like, according to Elliot? Like, what does she want us to do?
Well, she doesn't just want us to acknowledge the problem. You know, she wants us to take action.
Okay, so what kind of action?
She challenges white people to confront racism head on, like really challenge it whenever they see it.
Call it out.
Yeah, exactly. And to join organizations that are working for racial justice to put their money where their mouth is.
So it's about going beyond just talking about it, actually doing something.
Right. And also, she really pushes white people to examine their own privilege.
Which can be a tough one, right? No one likes to admit that they've had advantages in life.
It's definitely uncomfortable, but it's so important. Because if you don't acknowledge your privilege, you can't really understand how the system is rigged against other people.
That's true. So we're seeing this common thread here, right? Why is Elliot? They're both pushing for real systemic change.
Definitely. They're not satisfied with just lip service or token gestures.
They want to see action, concrete steps to address these deep-rooted inequalities.
Exactly. And it's not just about affirmative action. It's about dismantling all the systems that perpetuate racism and oppression.
So it's a much broader conversation than just college admissions or hiring practices.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating and so challenging.
Yeah, for sure. It really gets to the heart of what kind of society we want to be, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, so before we get too deep into that philosophical stuff, let's hear what Tim Wise has to say about economic inequality and policing.
Sounds good. I'm curious to hear his take on that.
Jimmy, too. This is where things get really nuanced because Wise argues that simply focusing on socioeconomic factors doesn't fully address racial disparities.
Interesting. So he's saying that even if we had perfect economic equality, there would still be racial problems.
Essentially, yeah. And he gives this example of middle-class Black families.
Okay, so families that are doing pretty well economically.
Right, but he points out that they're just as likely to live in segregated communities as Black families with very low incomes.
So even when Black families achieve economic success, they're still facing barriers based on race.
Exactly. And he says that's largely due to ongoing housing discrimination.
So even if you have the money to buy a house in a nice neighborhood, you might still face discrimination from real estate agents or lenders.
That's what he's saying, yeah. So it really complicates this idea that socioeconomic affirmative action would be a perfect solution.
Right. It's not as simple as just leveling the economic playing field.
Because racism is baked into so many of our systems and institutions.
And it's not always overt either. It can be those subtle biases that are hard to even recognize, let alone address.
Exactly. And Wise also makes this incredibly powerful statement about police misconduct.
Oh, yeah. What does he say?
He says, "The history of policing traces directly back to slave patrols."
Wow. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it's pretty eye-opening, right? He continues, "It was police who enforced the slave codes, segregation, It really puts things into a whole new perspective.
It does. It reframes the whole conversation about policing and race.
It's not about saying that all cops are bad, but it's about understanding the historical context.
And how that history continues to shape the present.
Exactly. Like, you can't just ignore that legacy of racial control and oppression.
It's woven into the fabric of law enforcement in this country.
Right. And that helps explain why the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color is so fraught, so full of tension and mistrust.
It's not just a coincidence. It's a direct result of that history.
And Wise also brings up the war on drugs, how it disproportionately targets Black and brown people, even though drug usage rates are similar across races.
Yeah, that's a classic example of how policies that seem race-neutral on the surface can actually have really discriminatory effects in practice.
And that raises serious questions about whether the system is truly fair or whether it's designed to target certain groups, regardless of their actual behavior.
Yeah, like, is it really about public safety or is it about social control?
Those are tough questions, but they're questions we need to be asking.
Absolutely. And I think all of these perspectives from Wise, Connerly, and Elliott, they're all setting us up for a really deep dive into the heart of this issue.
They are. We've got a lot to unpack here, a lot to think about.
But I think it's going to be a really fascinating and important conversation.
I agree. And, as we continue to explore this, I think it's crucial for each of us to really consider how these different perspectives apply to our own lives and experiences.
Yeah, like how do we fit into this bigger picture? What are our own biases and assumptions?
And what can we do to create a more just and equitable society? Those are the questions we need to be grappling with.
For sure. I think this is going to be a really thought-provoking deep dive.
I think so too. All right, well, we've got a lot more to discuss, so let's take a quick break and we'll be right back to continue this deep dive into affirmative action.
All right, so we're back and ready to keep digging into this whole affirmative action thing.
Yeah, lots to talk about.
We were just starting to touch on Connerly's idea of socioeconomic affirmative action before the break.
Right. Focusing on economic disadvantage rather than race.
And I'm curious, how would that even work in practice?
Well, the idea is that instead of giving preferential treatment based on race, you'd focus on things like family income, maybe neighborhood, those sorts of socioeconomic factors.
So like a kid from a low-income family, regardless of their race, might get a boost in college admissions.
Exactly. Or maybe they'd have access to special scholarship programs. I can see how that could, in theory, help level the playing field a bit.
Yeah, it's about addressing those systemic disadvantages that come with growing up in poverty.
But Wise would probably argue that it's not that simple, wouldn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Remember his point about middle-class Black families still facing housing discrimination?
Yeah, even if you have the money to buy a house in a nice neighborhood, you might still encounter those racist barriers.
Exactly. So even if we achieve perfect socioeconomic equality, which is, let's be honest, a pretty tall order in itself,
Right.
we're still not guaranteed to erase those racial disparities.
Because racism isn't just about economics, it's baked into the culture, the institutions, the very fabric of our society.
It's like, even if you have the same income as your white neighbor, you might still experience racism from the police, from shopkeepers, from random people on the street.
It's those everyday microaggressions that can really wear you down.
Yeah, and those aren't going to magically disappear just because everyone's making the same amount of money.
So socioeconomic affirmative action, it might be a step in the right direction,
Sure.
but it's definitely not a silver bullet solution.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, it might even create a whole new set of problems.
How so?
Well, think about it. You're still essentially giving preferential treatment, just based on a different criteria.
Instead of race, it's income.
Right. So you can bet that there would be people who would cry foul, who would accuse the system of being unfair to those who don't qualify for that socioeconomic boost.
I see. So it could just shift the target of those reverse discrimination arguments.
Exactly. Instead of saying it's unfair to white people, they might say it's unfair to, I don't know, upper middle class people or people who live in certain neighborhoods.
Yeah, I can see how that could play out.
And it also doesn't really address the historical legacy of racism. All those years of slavery and segregation and discrimination that have created this huge racial wealth gap.
It's like, even if we could magically make everyone's income equal tomorrow, Black families would still be starting at a disadvantage because of all the wealth they were denied for generations.
Exactly. So it's a complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
It feels like we're going in circles a bit, like every solution we come up with seems to have its own set of problems.
It's a tricky one, for sure. And I think it speaks to the deep-rooted nature of these inequalities. They're so intertwined with every aspect of our society.
It's not just about fixing one policy or changing one law,
It's about transforming our entire way of thinking about race and equality.
which, let's be honest, is a pretty daunting task.
Yeah, it's not going to happen overnight.
But I think that's why these conversations are so important. We need to keep talking about it, keep challenging our assumptions, keep pushing for change.
Absolutely. And I think that's what Elliot is really trying to get at with her message.
About unlearning those racist ideas we've internalized.
Yeah, and about taking action, actually doing something to dismantle those systems of oppression.
I'm curious, what are some concrete steps that people can take? Like, beyond just talking about it, what can we actually do to make a difference?
Well, I think education is a huge part of it.
Learning about the history of racism, understanding how it manifests in our society today.
Exactly. And being willing to have those uncomfortable conversations with friends and family, calling out racism when we see it.
Even if it's awkward or makes people uncomfortable.
Right, because silence is complicity. If we're not actively anti-racist, then we're passively contributing to the problem.
That's a powerful point. And I think it's also important to support organizations that are fighting for racial justice.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Donate to them, volunteer your time, amplify their voices.
And when it comes to things like voting, make sure you're supporting candidates who are committed to racial equity and social justice.
Yeah, our political choices have a huge impact on these issues.
So it's about being engaged citizens, not just in our personal lives, but also in the political sphere.
Right. Because ultimately, change happens from the bottom up and the top down.
We need to be putting pressure on our elected officials to address these systemic problems.
And we need to be holding each other accountable, challenging racist behavior and language in our own communities.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, right? Education, activism, political engagement, personal accountability.
Exactly. It's not about finding one perfect solution. It's about attacking the problem from all angles.
And being persistent, because this is a long-term fight.
Oh, yeah, this isn't something that's going to be solved overnight.
It's going to take generations to dismantle these systems of oppression that have been in place for centuries.
But I think it's a fight worth having.
I agree. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
There's always more to learn, always more to discuss.
I'm starting to wonder if this whole debate about affirmative action is really just a symptom of a much bigger problem.
What do you mean?
Well, it seems like we're so focused on arguing about the specifics of this one policy that we're losing sight of the bigger picture.
The bigger picture of systemic racism and inequality, you mean?
Exactly. Like affirmative action, it's just one small piece of the puzzle.
Right, it's addressing one symptom, but it's not curing the disease.
And maybe that's why it's so controversial, because it forces us to confront these deeper, more uncomfortable truths about our society.
Yeah, it's like this Band-Aid solution that's not really addressing the underlying wound.
And until we're willing to have those honest, difficult conversations about the root causes of inequality,
About race, about power, about privilege.
we're never going to truly solve the problem.
We're just going to keep spinning our wheels, arguing about the same things over and over again.
And meanwhile, people are suffering. Real people are being denied opportunities and justice because of the color of their skin.
Exactly. So I think it's time to shift the focus, to move beyond this narrow debate about affirmative action.
And start talking about the bigger picture, about the kind of society we want to create.
A society where everyone has the chance to thrive, regardless of their race or background.
That's the dream, right? But it's going to take a lot of work to get there.
It will. But I think we're up for the challenge.
I hope so. All right, well, on that note, I think we need to take another quick break. But when we come back, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the impact of affirmative action on individuals.
Sounds good to me. We've been talking a lot about the systemic stuff, but it's important to remember the human side of this issue.
Exactly. We'll be right back after this short break.
So we've been talking a lot about the big picture of affirmative action, but like we were saying before the break, it's also important to think about how these policies affect individuals, the real people whose lives are shaped by these decisions.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the abstract arguments and forget that there are human stories behind all of this.
Exactly. I mean, we can talk about statistics and policies all day long, but at the end of the day, this is about people's lives, their hopes, their dreams.
Their struggles, their disappointments. Right, the whole spectrum of human experience. And I think it's important to acknowledge that affirmative action can have both positive and negative impacts on individuals.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a black and white issue. There are a lot of gray areas.
For sure. Like, on the one hand, you have countless stories of people from marginalized groups who have achieved incredible things thanks, in part, to affirmative action.
People who might not have had access to those opportunities otherwise,
Yeah.
They might not have gotten into that top college or landed that dream job if it wasn't for those policies.
Exactly. And those are the success stories that we often hear about, the ones that make us feel hopeful about the potential for change.
But it's also important to acknowledge the other side of the coin,
The people who feel like they've been unfairly disadvantaged by affirmative action.
the ones who feel like they've been passed over for opportunities, even though they might be more qualified on paper.
And those feelings are valid too, It's not fair to dismiss their concerns or tell them they're just being whiny.
Right, because they're experiencing a real sense of injustice, and that can be really damaging.
It's like this double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to create more opportunities for historically marginalized groups, but in doing so, you might inadvertently create new inequalities or reinforce existing prejudices.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges with affirmative action. How do you balance those competing interests? How do you create a system that's fair to everyone while also acknowledging the need to address historical injustices?
Yeah, it's a tough one. And I think it highlights the importance of focusing on the individual, not just the group.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's easy to get caught up in the statistics and the big picture arguments, but we have to remember that affirmative action is ultimately about people.
Real people with their own unique stories, their own hopes and dreams.
Exactly. And I think sometimes those individual stories get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, it becomes this abstract debate about policy and ideology, and we forget that there are real human beings who are affected by these decisions.
So what can we do to make sure that those individual stories are heard? How can we bring more humanity into this conversation?
Well, I think it starts with listening,
Hmm.
you know, really listening to people's experiences, even if they're different from our own.
Being willing to step outside of our comfort zones and try to understand where other people are coming from.
Exactly. And I think it's also about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
What works for one person might not work for another.
And what seems fair to one person might seem incredibly unfair to someone else.
Right. So it's about finding that balance, that sweet spot, where we're creating more opportunities for everyone while also acknowledging the need to address those historical imbalances.
And I think that's going to require a lot of dialogue, a lot of compromise, and a lot of empathy.
I agree. And, at the end of the day, I think it all comes down to our values, right?
Our values as individuals and our values
Yeah.
as a society.
Like, what do we prioritize? Do we value fairness and equality? Do we believe in second chances? Do we want to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to succeed regardless of their background?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? And the answers are not always easy or straightforward.
No, they're not. But they're questions we need to keep asking because they're at the heart of this whole conversation about affirmative action, about social justice, about what kind of world we want to live in.
And even though we've been talking about this for a while now, I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
There's so much more to explore, so much more to learn, so much more to discuss.
But I think this has been a really good starting point. We've laid out some of the key arguments, explored different perspectives, and hopefully challenged some of our own assumptions along the way.
And hopefully our listeners have been challenged as well.
I hope so,
Yeah.
because this is a conversation that needs to happen not just in academic circles or on podcasts, but in our homes, in our workplaces, in our communities.
We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. And it starts with being willing to have these tough conversations, to listen to each other, to learn from each other, and to work together to find solutions.
Well said. So on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into affirmative action. It's been a real pleasure exploring this complex and important issue with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope you found this conversation insightful and thought-provoking. Keep asking questions, keep challenging your assumptions, and keep the conversation going.